Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911, Sustainability in Your Ear. If you're a first-time listener, we're glad to have you. We're always here talking with innovators about how we can make really substantial changes in our environmental impact and the way that we live. And we've talked many times on the show about the future of meat. Meat production accounts for the lion's share of greenhouse gas emissions in the human food supply. In fact, meat represents 57% of the emissions generated by feeding people, according to a recent study published in the journal Nature Food. Our guest today, Koby Nahmias, is the founder and president of Future Meat Technologies, an Israeli company that grows meat from animal cells in bioreactors. Sounds high-tech, and in fact, it is. Future Meat recently achieved an important goal, producing meat for less than $5 a pound. And it claims that its meat produces 80% less GHG emissions and uses 99% less land and 96% less water than traditionally farmed meats. The company ended 2021 by closing the largest venture investment in the history of lab-grown meat, $347 million. The funding will get them to market and help to build a U.S. production facility. We may be seeing Future Meat on our store shelves soon, so let's find out when. You can find out more and follow along at future-meat.com. That's future-meat.com. Koby, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Wonderful. Happy to be here.
Well, I'm pleased to have you. And you know, you guys are doing really interesting things. First off, congratulations on raising all that money. It raises an obvious question. Roughly when do you expect consumers are going to be able to purchase your meat in stores? What are we looking at in terms of a time frame?
So the two hurdles when bringing cultured meat to the masses that are left right now. I mean, the first hurdle was obviously the cost, and the second hurdle was the food safety that is, paramount in everything that we're doing. But once we got these two things out of the way, there are two major hurdles. One of them is regulatory. The FDA needs to decide that it's making a decision and then needs to approve cultured meat. It's a process that is going to take at least a year. And we expect to get the first waves of approvals probably the first half of 2023. So I would imagine that the first restaurants will start serving cultured meat probably in 2023 in the United States.
Really? Okay. That's earlier than I would have expected. In fact, I have read that the only nation currently allowing people to use the meat is the Netherlands. So there's a lot of regulatory boundaries to spread across the world. But you just described the FDA as a fairly fast-moving organization. I haven't heard it or experienced it being so. What could stop it? Are there any political or cultural concerns you think that they will be factoring into these conversations?
So let me correct it. So the Netherlands actually allowed trying essentially
tasting it,
meat, but not distilling. The first nation to approve cultured meat was actually Singapore. And cultured meat products, but some version are being sold in one restaurant in Singapore by Eat Just. And the FDA is actually filled with incredible people. There are some of the top scientists in the world that have been doing really innovative thinking about cultured meat and about genetically modified organisms, unrelated, at least not for us. And it's pretty advanced. It's actually started dealing with this process way before other regulatory agencies around the world. So I'm not surprised that the FDA is leading the way. I can tell you that even for organ-on-chip technologies, specifically substitutes for animal experiments for drug discovery, the FDA has also been leading the way. And we've been engaging, with them both on cultured meat and on, pharmaceutical development for my academic center. So yeah, don't sell them short. They're doing a really good job.
Well, and in fact, I believe that U.S. regulations are key to our competitive advantage, and the whole world will snap to the decision the FDA makes because our science is generally regarded to be both transparent and thorough. So not to knock the FDA, it's just that they do tend to take some time. And there are obviously a lot of issues with what their priorities are today. We're in the middle of a pandemic, for instance. So tell us about the process of culturing meat. There's an obvious question, and I know the answer, but I want everybody to hear. Does anything need to die to start this process? And how much meat can you grow from a single cell culture?
Right. So you can start a process many different ways. Cultured meat is the technology of taking cells from a live or dead animal and essentially growing them in tissue culture, growing them in bioreactors that are relatively similar to fermentation, for example, of yeast, of beer, of yogurt, and then taking those cells at the end of the process and structuring them in such a way that gives you the texture of meat. This is the concept behind cultured meat. And to answer your questions, you really need to address the different ways of getting the cells and then growing the cells. There are some companies, Masamit is one of them. So you know that Mark Post actually started all the excitement around this field with his first burger, what was it, 9 years ago almost?
Yes.
They are taking a biopsy from an animal and then growing that biopsy up in the lab. And from every biopsy, you can get about 800 kilograms, so about 2 cows. The problem is that there's a lot of quality control that you have to do on every single biopsy, and you still need, herds of cattle right outside the factory. So you're not hurting the animal, but on the other hand, there is a relatively limited number of times that cells can expand.
Okay.
A very different technology is to essentially get cells from an animal. It can be a biopsy or it can be a slaughtered animal, and then take those cells and allow them to immortalize, essentially allow them to change to cells that starts growing forever. And when we say grow forever, we mean essentially forever. We have lines that became immortal 4 years ago and past population doubling 1,000. What does that mean? It means that they doubled 1,000 times since the last time they saw an animal or an animal product. If you would gather all these cells together, you would have more mass than continental United States. Actually, you would have more mass than planet Earth, more mass than the galaxy, more mass than the observable universe. So if you immortalize your cells and do it properly, like we did at Future Meat Technologies, the cells are genetically stable and will grow forever, feeding not only our children, but our grandchildren to come on distant galaxies.
So in this case, you would not need a herd of cattle outside. You literally have a cell line that you're going to be able to cultivate and manage over generations.
That's right. And we're talking about generations and generations and generations and generations forever.
Is there any difference between growing, for instance, beef and chicken? And the other question that obviously follows from that, is there any meat you couldn't grow using this process?
No, you can grow any meat you'd like. I mean, we created stable lines for chicken about 3.5 years ago, and then for lamb about 2 years ago, and now we're doing the same for beef and pork. So we have lines right now running for beef and pork. Fish, crustaceans, anything you like.
So tell us what happens inside the bioreactor. The cells are in there, they're washed with a nutrient solution. What is going on in there as they grow? Is there a substrate or a structure on which they're growing in order to form the meat that we are familiar with?
Yeah, so let's split the concept into two. It really depends which company is doing what. So there are some companies that are doing exactly what you're saying. They're taking a soy sponge, we call it textured vegetable protein. You add it to the bioreactor and the cells physically stick on it. And as they expand, they start making something that looks like a muscle. It's a process that is relatively slow. It takes about 2 to 4 weeks to make this structure, to make this sponge full. And therefore, the costs are a little bit expensive. What we're doing is a little bit different. We are actually growing the cells as single cell suspension. So they're floating around individually in the bioreactor. They can be muscle or fat cells. And essentially, they reach a very high cell densities. We are reaching cell densities of about 130 billion cells per liter. That's 13 times more than anybody else. And when you get them from the bioreactor, they don't look like muscle, they look like a paste.
Okay.
And then what you do is you take the scaffold, the sponge that I described before, and then you add the paste to the sponge through an extruder, and you're getting the fibers of the muscle that way through a heating and pressurized cooking process. So it's a lot faster and it's a lot more robust than doing classical tissue engineering, but you get to the same thing again.
So the other really interesting question to me is you describe your meat as healthier than traditional meat. Now, on the one hand, that's pretty clear that you get rid of the slaughterhouse and all the fecal matter exposure and so forth that's associated with traditional slaughterhouse meat. But are you saying that it is healthier simply because it's cleaner, or could that meat be engineered to be healthier, for instance, delivering more or different nutrients than we're familiar with in beef or chicken today?
Yeah, so actually that's a wonderful question. So it is safer. And if you want to, and if when you're discussing the lack of fecal material and the lack, for example, of salmonella, which comes from the gut of a chicken, then it's a safer meat. But we are saying not only safer, but also healthier. Two reasons. One is the absence of saturated fats. So we can dramatically reduce cholesterol, but cholesterol it's not that bad for you to begin with. And plant-based substitutes also do that very, very well.
Sure.
The problem that both animal products and plant-based products have is that they still have a lot of saturated fat. It's either come from the animal fat itself or from coconut oil, which is a type of palm oil. Coconut oil is saturated fat. It's palmatic acids, and it's the only fat that is solid at room temperature. So it's the only one that you can add to your burger if you want to get a sizzle on the grill. If you want your fat to melt, then you're adding coconut oil. The problem is that according to some of the recent FDA studies, it's just as bad for you as animal fat. So many of the problems that we have with arteriosclerosis are coming from saturated fat, and if you can remove it, that'll be great. The advantage that we have in cultured meat is the fact that we're growing fat cells, and the reason they're solid at room temperature is because they have an envelope of phospholipids, the cell membranes. So we can have any type of fat in our fat. So the main fat we have is monosaturated. That means we can reduce the amount of saturated fat in our burgers, for example, by 80%, and still get the sizzle on
the flavor the fat adds.
And the flavor that the fat adds. So that's number one. I used to joke that the fat that we're using is actually coming from fructose. So it's the first reasonable thing I ever saw to do with high fructose corn syrup. But this is important. We're actually getting monosaturated fat without saturated fats in the product. Second thing I would add is that because we can control what type of fat goes into the cells and what are they synthesizing, we can dramatically increase, for example, the amount of omega-3 fatty acids. So the first product that we're going to have in the market is a chicken breast that has the same amount of omega-3 fatty acids as salmon. So this is going to be, a huge advantage. So when we say healthier, we actually mean healthier.
So that also suggests that you'll see kind of a designer meat, perfectly marbled steaks. And potentially it sounds like, and I don't think the word is correct, but hybrids with new flavor profiles. I mean, we could invent meats that are completely novel, it sounds like. Is that the case?
It is the case. You can make meats that are completely novel. You can 3D print meats today in very complex patterns. The issue is, though, that while we like to say that we're adventurous,
Yeah.
when it comes to our food, most people aren't. We'll go to a restaurant to eat a fancy type of, salmon, or we would like a chef to prepare it for us that has like a three-dimensional structure, and we would love to see, an orange hamburger that has the flavor of peanut butter. But we won't buy it for home. This is not going to be our bread and butter. This is not what we're going to serve our kids. And as a father of 5, I can tell you that that's probably the most important thing that I think about when I'm going to the supermarket is, what are my kids going to eat? What are they going to be willing to eat? And orange burgers are not on the menu.
Well, and you mentioned chefs, and earlier suggested that the first places we're going to experience this are in restaurants. It sounds like the presentation of these meats is going to, obviously it's going to require some cultural change. People are always, as we've seen with genetically modified crops, very concerned about this sort of thing. So getting the chefs to really make great meals that people talk about is also part of the go-to-market challenge that you face. How do you bring a new and literally novel material like cultured meat to market?
Well, for us at Future Meat Technologies, we're bringing it to market by make it as similar as possible to farmed meat.
Mm-hmm.
And this is essentially, this is very important that we do that. We have, chicken that is more dark meats, and we have chicken that is more breast meat. We have lamb kebabs, and we're working on lamb chops. Mm-hmm. So we're working on our burgers and our ground meat. Essentially, everything is going to feel the same, and it cooks the same. So if it doesn't, then we have a huge issue. But yes, our chicken has the same type of bite. It will cook. It will look like chicken. You will cook it on the griddle exactly like you do for chicken. You'll want it to reach 70 degrees exactly like you do for chicken, and you'll eat it in the same way. This is important. Otherwise, customers are going to have a dissonance. They expect something and they see something else. This is not going to be good. We think that people across the globe like meat, and they've been used to eating meat in a certain way for the last quarter of a million years. You don't want to change that.
That is a pretty big lift. I think you're well advised not to try to change our relationship with meat entirely, but it's interesting that new variants and new benefits of meat are going to be coming to market. That actually is going to set this apart. Let me change gears a little bit and ask about this. One of the largest inputs to cultured meat production is electricity. So how are you planning to power your production facilities? Are you going to use renewables? And if so, how does the use of renewable energy versus fossil fuel change the carbon footprint of your meat?
It actually takes very little amount of electricity to run a cultured meat facility, because the bioreactors themselves are insulated. Mm-hmm. So you're losing very little amount of heat. The temperature is constant. You're not bringing it up and bringing it down.
But isn't the refrigeration associated with keeping it that way, or one of the main inputs?
No, bioreactors are mainly are just heated. The refrigeration is happening mainly in the last or the end product. You don't really need to refrigerate only the end product.
I understand is there's an exchange system in most of these bioreactors where the nutrient is moving in, the fluid is moving in and out. It gets warm, it gets cooled back to the appropriate temperatures. I guess I misunderstood, or at least the articles I've read about it are not correct.
So not if you do proper installation. That's not an issue. Oh, okay. And also steering is a very minor input of electricity. The big change in energy comes from sterilization. When you're doing CAP, SAP, it means that you need to steam the bioreactors when you clean them at the beginning of the end of every process. So if your process was very, very short, like let's say, every 5 or 6 days, you'll have to steam clean the entire thing. then that would have been significant. But in the case of future meat technologies, we are using very, very long processes. So the process for us is a month long, and it's a continuous harvest during this month. So we are, in essence, using very little energy, very little steam power. And the analysis that we're doing is very, very favorable in favor of cultured meat compared to everything else, including chicken. And chicken are very, very cost effective when it comes to a carbon footprint.
Yeah.
So the biggest issue, though, by the way, in my mind, is water. Because if you are really perfusing the cells and giving them fresh nutrients all the time, you're going to be wasting a lot of water. But this is where our technology comes into play. We developed a technology called media rejuvenation. Let me try to explain that if I have a few minutes.
Go for it.
So when you grow yeast, right? You put yeast with sugar, and then the yeast grows and make alcohol as a byproduct. At the end, the alcohol gets to such a high level that it kills the yeast, and you have a nice glass of wine. However, when you're growing mammalian cells, let's say, beef or pork, lamb, or chicken is not mammalian, but still, it's the same basic biology. You're growing the cells up, but they're not making alcohol. They're actually making ammonia. When ammonia comes to a certain level, it kills the cells.
Right.
And regretfully, you don't have a nice glass of wine. You're going to have a nice glass of urine. So this is where our technology comes into play. We take the medium out and actively remove the ammonia, and then put the medium back in. So we recycle the process. It's kind of like an artificial liver, but based on a unique type of patented filtration that allows us to actively remove those byproducts. And because of that, we can get cells to go way above 10 billion cells per liter and all the way to about 130 billion cells per liter, with wasting very little water and getting the cell densities higher. So we did that so our factories will become a lot smaller than everybody else's. Our factory design is about 20 times smaller than everybody else. Simply because we can get so many cells out of every bioreactor batch. And because we're recycling the water almost completely, there is very little need for water. Otherwise, you're going to be washing out a lot of waste material and a lot of wasted nutrients in a cultured meat facility, and it's not something we want to do.
And when you remove that ammonia, that I assume you're disposing of that in a responsible way. It could even be used as a fuel in other contexts. So that is
no. I'm not disposing of the ammonia.
You're not. What are you doing?
No. I make it. So the waste products from the process are ammonia and lactate. I'm capturing it.
Right, and that becomes another potential revenue stream. You can sell that ammonia.
Again, exactly. That is close to $2 to $4 billion a year. And lactate is also super interesting because lactate is the building block of biodegradable plastic. And it shows up as a side stream from my facility. So as we start scaling up in the United States, we can double the global supply of biodegradable plastics as a byproduct of our industry.
It's fascinating when you think in sustainable terms that systems produce so many different valuable materials. And you're actually thinking about this as sort of a symphony of outputs rather than just making one thing. Do you think that is a mindset that a lot of companies need to consider and understand that everything that they produce, including the byproducts, what we have traditionally treated as waste, needs to become part of your business revenue stream or in some way contribute to the business?
Look, I think it's much easier for us because we're a new industry and we're starting designing the everything from scratch. So it's a lot easier for us to think about sustainable ways of factory production, right? We know how to do things with natural cooling. We know how to integrate to integrate windmills and solar cells right in the factory design itself. So there's a lot of things we can do because we're building our first factories. The other thing we can do is build it in such a way that the surrounding can use our byproduct. So ammonia, we can sell it as gas, but it's also an awesome fertilizer. You don't need to fix it. So you can actually use it as a fertilizer for the fields around the factory that is producing the soils for the factory itself. So there's a lot of options for circular economy once you start thinking about it, and this is where it starts. This is where it starts playing a major role in what we're doing. But there are other industries that are doing it. So if you go to the Berda printing houses in Germany, you'll see amazing recovery of water and dye in their printing businesses. They recover, I think, 99.9% of the dye. And so there's a lot of industries that are trying to get there, and everybody's starting to think about it. Everybody should.
So how much of the current meat supply do you think we can feasibly transition to cultured meat over the next couple of decades?
It's a huge industry. We're talking about something that is planetary scale. You talked about carbon emissions, but I don't think that's the biggest story. I think the biggest story is the land. Meat industry is using about 30% of all the arable land on the planet to produce meat.
Right.
So this is a lot of land. It used to be forested. This is part of it. And it's now essentially grazing area. This is the biggest thing. Now, like we said, we can reduce the land use by 99%. So it sounds incredibly exciting. But if you're talking about an industry that is using 30% of the arable land on the planet, well, 1% of that is 0.3% of the planet. That's a lot of space. That's a lot of factories that we need to build. So we're talking about a planetary scale challenge that is going to play over the next couple of decades. I think we can replace all of it, but it's not going to be easy.
All of it. So do you imagine that being a distributed system of regional production facilities, hyperlocal production, and essentially really shortening the supply chain for meat everywhere? Yes.
I think we can do it everywhere. And I think this is a unique solution for island economies, and also for countries that definitely don't have the massive reserves, ecological reserves that the US has, so sure. China is a definite, candidate here. We are blessed in the United States. We have rolling hills from East Coast to the West Coast that are, and massive resources of water. Even if the Colorado is drying up a little bit, the Great Lakes are still there.
Yeah.
And we probably have enough resources to feed the population even for the coming decade or two. But other countries are not as blessed.
Sure.
And they have dramatic challenges to feed their growing population. So this is where this type of technology can play massively. Even in the US, though, we can benefit dramatically from cultured meat. Imagine what happens if we release all this pasture land back to reforestation. We can make the United States carbon neutral for a decade just by releasing that land. Carbon neutral. I'm not talking about reducing carbon emissions. I'm actually talking about taking them out of the atmosphere.
And restoring the capacity of the planet's capacity to process that CO2 because you've reforested that land.
That's exactly true.
So I want to correct something I said in the introduction, that you've reached the $5 a pound barrier. You actually, it's about $6 a pound based on what we just discussed before I made the edit that folks don't hear. And you're on the way to lowering the cost to make it competitive with traditionally grown meat. What are the keys to achieving that kind of parity? Is it that you have to scale up production capacity? it's continued optimization? What are the factors that are going to change the price of cultured meat and make it competitive? Or is competitive the right word? Are we simply ready to pay more for a more sustainable solution?
I doubt it. At the end of the day, we need to get the protein that we eat at the right cost. So, or it will never be, or it will be a fad or something that only rich people eat. That's not in any way something that I'm interested in doing. If my kids can eat it, then I'm not interested. So let's talk about it. And it's again, I would have to split my answer into two, and I'm sorry for that. But there is, how did we get the price down from $500,000 per pound to $6 per pound? That's the first question, because it took us 7 years and no industry on the planet did it. If Tesla would be able to reduce their prices by that amount in 7 years, a Tesla would cost now, less than a packet of cigarettes. So, how did we do that? Well, the answer to that first question is by dramatically reducing the cost of the raw materials. You see, cells used to be grown with serum, with animal serum, which is pretty expensive. And it's also, you have to kill about 5 cows to make one burger, up until relatively recently for most companies. And when we developed the first serum-free media 3 years ago, we started seeing very rapid reductions in costs. So the first step was almost, half the cost, and then, dropping it to 20% of what it was. But that's not enough. When you're making media, essentially the raw materials that the cells eat, there are two things that are driving the cost up. One is a serum protein called albumin. It's essentially a protein that takes lipids and pushes them into the cells. And the second thing is growth factors, essentially the hormones and the signals that the cells need to survive. We started with a very different type of cell than everybody else. A lot of other companies are using stem cells. We are not using stem cells. We're using fibroblasts. These are cells of the connective tissue that every time you get cut, these are the cells that close the cut in hours. They're very, very robust. They need very few growth factors to remain phenotypically stable. So the cost goes down because you started from a very different starting point.
Okay.
And then we managed to remove them entirely by allowing the cells to start making them themselves. So
they're signaling to one another.
They're signaling to one another that they want to grow. The other thing that we did is we found albumin in chickpeas. So it turns out that albumin, which is a serum protein, is also found in hummus, which is great because we love hummus. So it's a homolog protein, and you can get it from chickpea isolate. And when you add it to the media, you don't need any more serum protein. So the animal media that we use, the media that we're using right now is animal component free. There is no more animal components. Everything is coming from the plant kingdom. And we managed to reduce the cost significantly. By how much? Well, the industry as a whole is paying on average $160 per liter of raw materials. The pharmaceutical industry, so companies like Pfizer and Merck, are paying close to $20 per liter of raw materials. We managed to make media for $1.30. $1.30. That's 100 times less than everybody else.
It also sounds like you become a supplier to a variety of other industries who are interested in culturing many things.
Yes, and this is essentially one of the things that COVID did for us was that it forced us to become independent. It forced us to bring in the expertise in Israel. It's an amazing country with a lot of excellent R&D. To do media development in-house, to essentially explore raw materials and develop them to reach something very, very unique ahead of a lot of other companies. And that was the major hurdle and the major ability to get the price down. From now on, it's all about rejuvenations and operations and increasing the densities and the yield of the systems. The media rejuvenation technology that I spoke about, the one that actively removes ammonia and lactate, this allows us to reuse about 70% of the raw materials. Again, it's a massive cost reduction, and this will take us all the way to the last step.
This is really quite a vision. And I want to close out by asking, what do you think the meat supply is going to look like in 2030? Or how far will we have moved the food mix from traditionally grown to beginning to be cultivated and produced in this industrial fashion?
So, we say that prophecy was given to fools, but so I'm not going to try to prophesize.
We're not going to hold you to it. We're not going to call you in 2030 and say, hey, you were wrong.
I need you to call me in 2030.
And we will call you in 2030, but we won't call to point out your mistakes. We'll try to find out what we've learned.
No, here's the deal. My wife makes sure that I do, make sure that she tells me when I'm wrong. So, what I would like to happen, in the next 10 to 20 years is to start seeing a continuum of products in the supermarkets. And I think this is hopefully where we're going. We're going to see, traditional vegan products like tofu, still being a significant mainstay on the supermarket shelves.
Sure.
Right next to them, there are going to be plant-based meat alternatives that give you the texture of meat that some people might prefer. And then we're going to have next to them the cultured meat products. Cultured meat products that are, I hope they're going to be the most significant segment because they can recapture not only the texture, but also the aroma and the flavor and even the health benefits of meat. And then I don't think meat products are really going away. I think they're going to be there because there's always going to be a population that really likes them and that really wants them there. At the end of the day, we have bison meat in Target, right? It's there. And I think we're going to still have those. We're still going to have those steaks. They're going to take an ever-shrinking part of the shelf. And we might even start seeing some of those blends of animal and plants. Because this is, for example, where Tyson was going a few years ago with their ground and routed path. And it does make sense.
So what's the best way our listeners can keep up on your progress? What do you suggest they do? Visit the site, sign up for a newsletter?
Yeah, visit our site. I think that's going to be great. And then looking at our press releases, and hopefully we'll have a much more engaging customer-focused brand over the next few months that are going to specifically inform people of our progress.
Well, Koby, I want to thank you for taking time to talk with us today. It's been fascinating.
Thank you, Mitch. I really appreciate your time, and I love the podcast.
We've been talking with Yakkov. Koby is his nickname, Nahmias, who is the founder and president of Future Meat Technologies. Do go check out Future Meat Technologies at future-meat.com. We face so many new options. It's not that we are going to lack choices. It's how are we going to understand the choices and their impact on the environment around us as we make this transition from an extremely inefficient industrial world to one in which it's sustainable and prosperous. Take some time to learn about what you're eating and look into how you can change it to reduce your impact. This is Earth911, Sustainability in Your Ear. We're going to be back with another innovator interview soon. But in the meantime, I hope that you'll take a few minutes to share this podcast or one of the others, many others that we have produced with your friends and family. As we like to say, more ideas is going to produce a lot less waste. We'll be back soon. Take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.